Hello everybody, I promise this one is not going to be satire, although my last video was fairly well received. There's just a large backlog of video topics that I've wanted to do and just haven't been able to because of work, not just this last time, but going back into January, even last year. And this is something that it's a common kind of topic to go. It's an interesting topic to look at. It's prompted by a brief comment exchange that I had on not one of my videos, but on someone else's. Someone else had made a video critical of Stefan Molyneux, and they said a lot of things about Stefan Molyneux that I agree with, because most of you know I'm not a huge fan, or I guess I'd say I have pretty mixed feelings. I respect and appreciate a lot of what he's done, and then recognize there's a lot of things that he's done that I can't condone or whatever. But at one point, this guy started criticizing Stefan Molyneux, saying, "Look, he doesn't know what he's talking about because he keeps harping on private property. Private property is wrong, obviously, and it doesn't exist." And I chimed in, and I don't like making lots of comments. I tend to prefer making a video just because nobody's going to read all the comments, or it's very unlikely anyway, and it's just a much better if you have a point, if you're trying to get a point across, doing so in a forum where very few people, perhaps no one, is going to see it, it really seems like a waste of time. Now, if there's a particular circumstance that makes it seem plausible that somebody will be persuaded or whatever, that's different. Or if you only have an audience of one, but you're pretty sure they're listening, that's fine. But that's definitely not what I was feeling here. So, the argument, you'll have this a lot, because libertarians, and not just libertarians, but especially libertarians, will have so many positions that are predicated on the existence and the legitimacy of private property, whether we're talking about whether or not the government can tax, how you can act, if you can have freedom of contract, all those sort of things. These all depend deontologically and also in terms of utilitarian functionality on there being a property regime, that is based on individual autonomy. Um, not that there can't be multi-owners of the same thing, but you can't have collective ownership, you can't have state ownership, you can't have non-ownership. And the point is sometimes raised in the context of these debates, and I really only see this raised in the context of debates. I don't see people, left-leaning intellectuals writing big books, or giving lectures, and maybe they have, and I just haven't seen them, that are explaining this out, or fleshing this out, or making this argument. I find that it's only um, a notion that's raised in the context of a debate with usually a libertarian, if not maybe a conservative, or something else like that. Um, and it's one of those things, I think, that if you don't think about, and if you don't know anything, it sounds like it might be a useful debate strategy, but it doesn't really stand up to any scrutiny. So the idea is that property rights don't exist in any real sense. It's just some idea, and like any idea, it can be wrong, and it can change, and that private property rights don't exist really. And so we have this whole political philosophy, libertarianism, that's based on something that's extremely flippant, and could change, and temporary. And this person in particular said it's just something that was invented by some philosopher. That private property is something that was invented by some philosopher. Now, even if you don't put in the proviso that it be a philosopher, if it's just an invented idea, if it's just something that's only existence is ideological and specific to human society, then that diminishes it to a certain extent. However, that statement really begs the question: if it was invented by somebody, then who was it? Was it John Locke? Did John Locke invent property rights? And of course, the answer is obviously no, because they existed before him. They existed in places that he couldn't possibly have influenced, and this problem arises with anybody that you can name. Right? There's no philosopher, there's no historical figure that we can point out and say, that's the one. It was Aristotle, or it was Seneca, or it was Cicero, or it was Ptolemy, or it was Alexander the Great, or it was Hesiod. I mean, a lot of times I've heard Hesiod listed as the first libertarian, or the first writer who has some kind of libertarian instance. They're Homer. Homer, if you read the Iliad and the Odyssey, there's well-defined property rights in that story. Achilles is mad because Agamemnon violated his property rights regarding a slave that he took. So you can say, oh, well, maybe Homer invented it, but anyone you can name, we're going to be able to find examples that predate that person, and examples in areas that it seems highly improbable that their influence could have ever reached. So, if anthropologists go to the highlands of New Guinea and they discover property rights, or in Queensland, Australia, there's a famous, I wish I could remember the details, but there was a famous case involving land ownership in Australia where this guy who lived on an island north of, I believe, Queensland, told everyone that he owned this property there, that in his tribe, in his ethnic group or whatever, private property is explicitly a divine institution that a particular god had instituted, and that he had his plots of land, and people told him, no, that all belongs, that's all Queensland, that all, not the province, but like the crown owns all that. That's all government land, essentially. And it's very, it'd be kind of silly to say, well, this guy's notion of private property, his tribe in North Queensland, they got that idea from John Locke or from Aristotle or Hesiod or whoever else. And the same could be said of, everybody, all existing property outside of a pretty narrow section of Western society. And so, the question becomes, if you're going to claim that property rights are something that were just invented by somebody, but you can't say when, you can't say by who, it puts a lot of doubt into that statement. And of course, you could say, well, we don't know the name, but somebody did. But if you can go back, you can't point to classical Greece and say, well, this is where it started, because we can find societies predating classical Greece that clearly have private property. You can't say, the Nile River Valley or the Harappan civilization in the Indus River Valley or in the Yangtze Delta or in the Yucatan or wherever else. There's no place that you can point that we can't find earlier examples to. So, this narrative of, well, it's just something that was invented, is very problematic, because it doesn't have any evidence of who invented it. I mean, there's a couple, and I joked John Locke because it seems like there's this idea that libertarianism is really only springs from a very small number of people, and the people that are listed are actually people who are not even the most influential within the libertarian movement as it stands today. People like John Locke, Ayn Rand, Milton Friedman. It's very unusual for these people to even mention somebody like Rothbard, which is not to say Rothbard is the wellspring of all libertarianism, only that he's a pretty influential figure. And if you're going to dismiss it as having originated from a few people and you don't even list him, it shows that it's a pretty good demonstration that you're not at all familiar with the topic that you're dismissing. But yeah, we can go all the way back, and we can look at even Paleolithic, Mesolithic, Neolithic societies, and they have what appears to be private property. And it's very hard to explain this as an intellectual invention. Now, a school of thought has kind of developed that shows that, because the assumption is always that, well, only humans have property, but many people within zoology began accumulating evidence to the contrary, that property rights exist not only among humans but among many species, especially birds, many of the mammals, and even fish, and even insects. And a good book that I've recommended before, but I haven't read. Now, in the course of these comments, I decided I was going to cite this book, and I thought, you know what, before I cite it, I should actually read it. I had it on my shelf for a long time, and so this book, and there's more than one book that kind of take this approach. There's a really good one called Boundaries of Order by Butler Schaefer that kind of makes this argument. But kind of the original one, and it's not an explicitly libertarian book at all. It's an examination of the animal kingdom, essentially. It's called The Territorial Imperative by Robert Audrey. Here's my copy. This has been reprinted a couple times. And Audrey's an interesting guy. Apparently he has some formal education in anthropology, and did stuff in it back in the 1920s and 30s, and then he became very involved as he became a playwright, and he was writing plays. And so you'd say, well, what is his expertise here? How can you know what he's talking about? Well, he was apparently very interested in these topics. He's extremely well read in them. If you read the book, that's very clear. And I don't know, in the late 50s or the early 60s, he became very interested in human evolution. He went and met, the Leakeys, Raymond Dart, all these luminaries in the kind of the real. I mean, obviously Charles Darwin, and going way back, had assumed humans were related to apes, but when it wasn't until the 50s and 60s that you started to actually get scientific archaeology, examining early hominids. And this guy he met all these people, and he wrote a book called African Genesis, which is one of the 2 or 3 books that actually popularized the idea that humans evolved from animals, from apes, and that they evolved in Africa. And the first book is called African Genesis. And he's, so his literature has actually been very influential on a cultural level. Um, uh, this book was written, I believe, in the 60s, and it would be nice if it could be rewritten, because from everything I've read, what we know about animals has increased many, many hundreds, if not thousands of times than what it was back then. Um, to the book's credit, it begins with a preface written by a modern zoologist who basically says the basic gist of his arguments, if not all of the specifics, hold true. And the basic gist of it, and there's a couple points here that don't actually relate to territory, that are pretty interesting too. Um, it's actually kind of hard to categorize the book because it covers a wide amount, and it has more than one focus. But that animals have property rights, and he spends a lot of time talking about birds. Basically, and this isn't research he did, but what do you call it? Ornithologists, they study live birds, I'm not sure. Ornithologists, especially in the UK, would basically, I guess this was like a popular thing among the English gentry, to go and study birds and just watch them and watch them and watch them and watch them and record and record and record every species, all these warblers and robins and swallows and sparrows and just finches and all kinds of birds that really I couldn't care less about. But they study them, and basically anyone who does comes to the conclusion that not only do they have property rights, but they're extremely territorial, and almost everything they do revolves around that reality. That males are not singing to attract a mate; they're advertising that they have property, that they have a section of land, that they'll attack anybody who comes within it. Um, that they'll never, or almost never, go into other areas. And he goes on to describe how deep the propertarian instinct goes. He identifies it in insects, especially crickets. The fact that some crickets fight is well known. The reason they fight is because of territorialism. And even worms, certain types of worms anyway. Their territorialism is, I don't want to say it's a stretch. It's very, very basic. Essentially, I forget what type of worm it was. A very primitive type of worm that has no brain. Essentially, just has a nerve going through the back, and it actually there's one neural connection between them, and that's like its brain. But it has like no, no feeling, no gut, no anything. And yet these worms, if you put them in an environment that they're familiar with, they'll feed and behave more readily than if you put them in an alien environment, where they will still do those things. They'll still feed, they'll still take in nutrients, but they'll hesitate and they'll wait quite a bit longer. And it's kind of a question of how. They also do things like researchers were able to train them to go through mazes and such. I'd love to see more up-to-date research on that kind of stuff because it's very interesting. Now, he doesn't draw too many conclusions. His argument isn't anchored in the behavior of worms. He's only saying we find this a lot in the animal kingdom, and we even find this in very primitive, so-called primitive species. And it's extremely wide-ranging. In fact, you can't say it's ubiquitous. There are species that doesn't appear to be territorialism in, or proprietarianism. However, often that is a function of our ignorance. If you were just casually watching robins, you wouldn't realize that they have property rights. It's only through very, very stringent observation that becomes clear. And I just use robins as an example. Apparently, robins in the UK are different from the robins in the United States, but I'll leave that confusion to you two. So, how this is pertinent, though, is that if property rights, exist within the animal kingdom, are widespread within the animal kingdom, then it's very hard to say that they're invented by, some philosopher or just some ideology. that Murray Rothbard came up with them, or John Locke, or Hesiod, or whoever else. All these philosophers are doing are describing something that already exists prima facie. And I think that's what most of them would say. I don't know that John Locke was claiming, and I haven't read much of John Locke, just a little bit, but I don't think he was ever claiming like, look, this didn't exist, I'm inventing it now. He was attempting to describe something, and obviously his intellectual input is valid and important in the sense that it elaborates and attempts to explain, and maybe can affect how future people think on the topic because they read him. But I don't think any of them are claiming like this is something that I'm inventing by this book or by the treatise or whatnot. Now the counterclaim, and I made most of these arguments in the comments without using the book because I hadn't read it yet. Said, well, no, when animals do territorial things, when a pack of wolves defend an area, or a lion defends an area, or the first example he uses is an animal I'd never heard of before called the Ugandan kob that has very, very strict property rights. That's not an indication of property rights. That's an indication of nationalism and statism. That when a Ugandan kob isolates a green of a little section of earth for its mating pad, that's it establishing a little state. And this really does strike me as a spur of the moment argument made in the context of a debate, and not something that's actually thought through or that persuasive. Now, can you find are there similarities between proprietarianism, private property, and statism? Yes, there are similarities. Certainly, there is a territorial element. There's a coercive violence element, and these things, there are similarities, but it's an equivocation to say that they're the same. And I think that you would have to say that to make this argument. For instance, there's lots of people. We have states in human society now, most of human society anyway. But we also have private property in human society. And within the context of our society today, nobody makes the argument that they are interchangeably identical. The farmer who places no trespassing signs around his acreage, nobody would accuse him of becoming a state, that there's now United States and now 85 acres of farmland. It's also a state. I don't know anyone who would make that argument. And yet that's the logic here. And I think it's just sheer equivocation. There's an added element to statism beyond private property. Now, can we find evidence of states in the natural world? Possibly. They're much, much rarer, and they're much more debatable. The ones that people would like to use are just inappropriate uses of metaphor. So like an ant colony, people say, well, there's a queen, and the queen controls everything, and this is just using the terms and projecting what they mean in human society to what they mean in an ant society inappropriately, I would say. The queen isn't giving out orders. She has like scents that go out, and like they will respond. If she's in heat or whatever, maybe the ant colony will act differently, but her volitional change isn't there. She's not a judicial authority. She doesn't have the ability to tax or anything like that. It's just like calling a lion the king of the jungle, and then saying, look, he's the head of a feudal aristocracy. And it's like it doesn't quite follow. Now, like I said, there could be antecedents in the animal kingdom, maybe in some of the chimpanzees. I think maybe among wild dogs, wolves. You can make the argument. It's harder to make, and it's not nearly as widespread, but it could be made. But the equivocation between the two, human societies throughout history have been stateless, mostly. I'm not using that as an argument to say we need them to be stateless now, or that's optimal. But the argument, there's no anthropologists, there's no historians who would go and say human society has always had states. They don't go and find these little trinkets, these the material goods of Paleolithic people, and say, see, they clearly have differential ownership of whatever, and so they must have had a state. They don't say that. Nobody. If you look, when did states arise? The articles on Wikipedia or the books that have written about it, they don't say states have always existed as long as there's been property. That's just it's a completely ridiculous statement. And yet the argument here, the attempt to nullify the ubiquity of property rights within the animal kingdom, and to then kind of twist it and say, oh no, that shows that they're states, would require you to say, oh, there have always been states, going all the way back, not to the Neolithic period or to Mesopotamia or Egypt, but before there were even hominids, and before there were even vertebrates, is a huge strike. I mean, it's an equivocation. You're basically saying there's no difference between the two, that they're the same thing, and I think that can't be. That's an indefensible thing to say. And you know the it's one of those claims that, again, it's not supported. There's no research. It's just in the context of an debate, in an attempt to win a debate, you're going to just say that the other person's premises are completely wrong, or you're going to try and attribute them to something different, and in the process you make completely outlandish claims. And I think that's definitely what was happening in this case. So it's an interesting book. It gives lots of examples. There's fish that make nests, and they keep out other fish. It's hard to see how that would be a state. I mean, well, he's just a state of himself and his mate and his brood, and that's it, but nobody else. It's very hard to say that it's not propertarian. Very hard to say that. I mean, the property line is very exact. The other thing and this is kind of what I meant when the book has multiple focuses. It's not, the title is territorially imperative, but it also talks about other things. He basically makes the argument that animals have morality. Now, it's not morality like ours. They have different rules or whatnot, but there seem to be rules by which their societies function, and that he talks about certain types of monkeys where each little group of monkeys have their own area, very territorial, that they'll never cross, and except for one day a year when they'll all go and they'll all mate with each other, and then they'll come back. And it's like, okay, that's a very, very strict, nuanced law, basically, but they don't have a king, they don't have anybody, and it's not like our morality. We don't have a rule where nobody can interfere with each other, and then one day a year we all go and fuck each other. But they clearly have their own rules, and it's there, and it's quite prevalent. And when we can't see it often, it's because we just don't have the discernment to see it, not because it's not there. Which is not to say that it's always there, and I'm just saying it must be everywhere all the time, and we just can't see it. I mean, maybe, but who knows? I think we need to do a lot more research. I wish that this book could be rewritten now, because I know that the amount of data that we have about the animal kingdom is vastly more than he had. Again, the preface in the book does help in that regard, because it's much more recent. I think this book was written this copy was printed in the 90s, which fast forwarded quite a bit. The original author, Audrey, yeah, Audrey died in the early 80s. So yeah, property rights, it's very hard to single them out as being merely a Homo sapien thing, or let alone merely a Western or libertarian thing. They seem to be much broader than the animal kingdom than that. Very much broader. They go much farther back, and they're much wider spread. Now, that by itself doesn't prove that there couldn't be a better system, right? Now, he brings up in the book, he does juxtapose the private property societies of, say, the West versus the Soviet Union. Now, he's writing this book in the 60s, when the Soviet Union was still, the Leviathan, the most powerful state that Paul Simonson said was going to overtake the United States. And he made the point, like, look, a Soviet farmer has far less incentive because it's not his. And he's basically kind of predicted the end of the Soviet Union by saying, look, there's no incentive. And there's lots of interesting aspects to this. When a private property holder land is invaded, they have a success ratio in terms of defense that they can't be explained by mere physicality. It's almost like there's just this force within life that makes an individual defending its property, and this is not just humans, but in fact, it might even be less so with humans than with other animals, to the point where very often you're talking about 70-80% success rates. It's even ignoring variables like the size of the attacking force or whatever. It's very similar to the predator-prey ratio. Predators in general are only successful 30% of the time, and prey, when they're trying to elude, are successful 70% of the time. It's very hard to assume that those ratios just accidentally happen across so many different species. It's also very hard to just explain away this, what would be the word? I mean, this benefit to defending your own property, your own little piece of territory. And it's not just territory. That's the most ubiquitous type. There's other types as well. Um, and yeah, it's fascinating. And I'd always heard this book in the context of proving the Soviet Union wasn't going to work, or explaining why it wasn't going to work before it fell apart. You know, obviously there are lots of people afterwards coming up with reasons why it didn't work, and you leave it to someone like Audrey or someone like Mises who actually called it ahead of time. Mises before it even started, Audrey 25 years before it fell apart, at a time when people thought it was doing really well and about to take over the world, or maybe would take over the world at some point. But so anyway, this is not to say that we couldn't hypothetically have a different system of property norms, say a collective one or a state one. Those can't exist. You know, I wouldn't say that because worms and crickets have private property that humans need to have them as well. However, to dismiss private property as being just this extremely superficial ideological movement that can be traced back, but they can't really say where. I've never had anyone, you know, when I pose this question, be able to say, "Oh no, this is the guy. Ayn Rand invented it." I mean, that would be a ridiculous example, but any of a patently a ridiculous example, but any other person they could name would be no less ridiculous. All right, if you said Aristotle, that would be just as ridiculous as saying Ayn Rand, essentially. Unless you're so historically ignorant that as far as you know, there were no property rights, you know, before, I don't know, the 4th century BCE in Greece. But you'd be wrong about that if that's what you think. So anyway, I think that's all I want to talk about on this particular topic. I kept it under 30 minutes, and I will talk to you all later.